as a network of leaders to provide encouragement, support, and resources for church leaders. Because we realize that to have healthy churches, we need to have healthy leaders. Okay, so our focus is on, your spiritual and emotional health. And today's seminar is on grief. And the things that I'm going to be talking about today, I'm going to give you a little bit of background, a little history on grief, and kind of a perspective of how things were approached, starting in 1969 with Kubler-Ross and the stages of grief. And then some of the most recent research about grief and our understanding of it. There has been a lot of research that's been done in the last 50 years. And there's actually even a name for people who do the research on death and dying and loss and grief. They're called thanatologists. How many of you knew that? I just learned that. So I'm sure none of you knew that either. Thanatology is about the study of death, dying, loss, and grief. So, so there's that. And then towards the end, I want to bring out some Barna research and talk about some things that are going on currently, and relate it to church leaders and churches, and just the weariness that's gone on in the last couple of years because of all the things that have gone on. So with that, what I'd like to do is just have each one take a minute or so and tell us who you are, where you're from, and just why you tuned in today, what you hope to get out of this. So Evelyn, want to start with you?
Sure, yeah. I'm Evelyn. I'm from Blacksburg Ablaze. I'm here to help with stuff, but also to get a sort of perspective that I don't usually have on grief and like church-based, since I'm sort of new to the leadership side of this world.
Okay, and Blacksburg, that's in West Virginia, is that correct?
No,
In Virginia.
Virginia.
Yeah.
Okay.
the western part of the state.
Okay. And Tony.
Yeah. So I'm Tony Pearson. I'm actually in Blacksburg as well. My father and my father-in-law both passed away in the last 6 months. And speaking of grief, I'm releasing my hawk in about 30 minutes. So I'm going to be leaving and watching this on video. But just again, I deal with a lot of people, of course, in ministry who are also dealing with grief, and just being able to help them through the process, and again, help myself through the process is why I'm here.
Yeah, and Tony said he's releasing his hawk. He's into falconry, if any of you are familiar with that. He got a hawk in the wild, he trained it, and he takes people on outings where they release the hawk to catch game, and the people get to participate in all that and observe. And it's just a really neat way that Tony has used that just to connect with people, sometimes share the gospel with them. But it's been a passion of his. So, and I'm sure the relationship that you developed with Misha, that's hard to release them.
It is, but actually there's gonna be 10 people there, and many are not believers, and I'll actually get to share the gospel this morning. So I'm looking forward to that.
Very cool. Okay. Dottie.
Figure out how to unmute. I'm Dottie Michikowski, and I live currently in Brighton, Michigan, but at this moment I'm in Chicago, Illinois, visiting our daughter. Lived for 14 years just outside of Lynchburg, Virginia, so we're very familiar with Blacksburg and that beautiful area, so we miss it. Looking forward to just being here and continually learning how to support people in grief, whether in ministry. We're part of TPM and at our church at Oak Point, and I do some coaching and mentoring, and grief is just something that is just a part of life, and I'm just looking for more and more ways to, number one, understand the grief process, and also how to come alongside people and help them in their grief through the process.
Yeah, and I would say Dottie is a very integral part of our TPM team at Oak Point. She has stepped up in a very integral way in the training and the mentoring at Oak Point and the TPM team. So glad you made it this morning.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Bruce. Bruce
Yeah,
is
hi,
Bruce is from Arizona.
Yep, down here in the land of the soon to be very hot.
Yeah.
Beautiful today though. So, yeah, I'm also involved in the TPM at Oak Point through Zoom, and I'm discovering that the grief that I experienced when I was 10 from my dad's loss, that I developed some very interesting behaviors that's hard to describe, that I'm still practicing. So I don't think I've ever really processed that, and it's affecting my behaviors. And then also too, on the I've interacted, been a lot of different layperson in a lot of different ministries through the years, and so if I get more healthy, then obviously whatever I share will be more in tune with God's design. So
Great. Thanks, Bruce. Good to have you.
thank you.
Mr. Biang, Tomas. Unmute.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so I'm Tom Biang. I'm here in West Lafayette, Indiana. I'm ministering at Purdue University, so I'm a pastor with Fred here. Yeah, and I'm on. Rick's one of my favorite people, and so is Tony. So I figured I'd jump on here and hear what they had to say. But I think, especially for those of us who are pastoring or in ministry, like the last couple of years, have brought up a lot of hard things in our own lives or with our churches. That, like, I think grief is going to be really an important part of that process. So I'm just here to listen and try to learn for myself and know how to love and support other people through this too.
Great. Good to have you, Tom. Okay. Mr. Kitchen, you still there, Jim?
I am here.
Okay.
I'm here. Welcome. I feel I'm really glad to be here. I am also on this transformation prayer team with Dottie and Rick and Bruce and Brad also. And I'm here in New Hudson, Michigan. I was able to attend the C1 network meeting in Florida this year. And Evelyn, I don't know, you probably met 200 people there, but you helped me get the app on my phone and stuff. And thank you for all your behind the scenes stuff. And I met Tony also, and was very impressed with this whole idea of C1 network. And Rick invited me to be part of that. And Rick is he's a friend, he's a mentor, and he's a partner in this transformation prayer ministry. And so I'm really glad to be able to be here. With regards to, I also offer, like Dottie, I'm a coach also, and looking to integrate the hard encounter experience like we get with transformation prayer, along with helping to come alongside people to coach them in their ministry or in a life transition or whatever they're dealing with. So I have had losses, major losses in my life. So I have done grief share and things like that. That's been very helpful to me. So I'm very interested in the things that Rick is going to present, and really glad to be here.
Great. Thanks, Jim. Did we miss anybody, or is this it?
Brad Walters.
Oh, Brad showed up. Okay, Brad, introduce yourself and tell us what you hope to get out of this.
Hello, my name is Brad Walters. I'm about 15 minutes from Rick currently. I met them at the Oak Point Church, part of Transformation Prayer Group. So just kind of learning more about grief and sorrow and biblical approaches and what's the appropriate way. And because I've just seen way too many things not work in my life and other people's lives. So I wanted to correct that and be the change.
All right. Good to see you, Brad. It's been a while.
Thanks, Rick.
All right. Okay, so is that everybody? Okay, then I'm Rick, and I'll just share with you that for me, grief has been a huge part of my life and experience as a believer. I'm the youngest of 6 kids, and my father drowned in a boating incident when I was 2 years old. So that you can imagine had a profound impact on me. And when I got saved at age 23, there was a significant shift in my perspective on it. Having the Lord as my guide and someone who was always with me, that made a huge difference. But there was still pieces of grieving that I hadn't done. And I didn't do until I attended a weekend seminar at Equipping Ministries International in Cincinnati, Ohio. And so I may sprinkle in a little bit of my own story as I share some of this information, because I think that's relevant. And also, as the youngest, observing my siblings and my mom especially, and just the impact that loss had on my whole family. So I may sprinkle some of that in as well, because I think it's relevant and helpful for understanding. But I'm going to go ahead and just commit the time and pray here before I jump into all this stuff. All right. All right, Lord, thank you for this time and everyone who has tuned in. And each person has interest here and their own personal story. And I just pray that this information would minister to them. And also, a lot of these folks are ministering to other people. So I pray that you'd use this information to really help them to be instruments of yours, to minister to others and to help them walk through their grief. So thank you for the opportunity to do this. I pray that you'd use it for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay. So starting off with a definition here, grief is deep sorrow, especially caused by someone's death. But it's also, and this isn't in the dictionary, but I add this, grief is really a reflection of what we've loved or have been attached to. So we don't like the feeling of grief. We don't like feeling sorrow or sadness, but that's a reflection of the fact that we've loved someone or something, and there's been a significant attachment. And so a lot of the grieving process is learning how to deal with life when that's gone. And but a secondary definition, more of an informal definition, and we'll find, because I'm going to be going through some scripture verses about grief, where grief is mentioned, and most of those, in fact, pretty much all of them, have to do not so much with death, but with secondary losses. And so the informal definition is it's trouble or annoyance, something that's troubling to you or annoying. Okay. So, and there will be time for some interaction. Maybe in the middle and at the end, but for now, let me just go through this. So scripture verses, first one, Genesis 6:6, the Lord said, well, it says, the Lord was sorry that he made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. Okay. So being made in God's image, he feels grief. So, I mean, we're going to feel grief as well. 1 Samuel 20:39. This is about Jonathan and David. And just in the context there, I mean, Jonathan loved David, and Jonathan was David's biggest fan, supporter. And in reaction to the way his father treated David, it says, Jonathan, in fierce anger, for he was grieved over David because his father had dishonored him. And then Job 30:25 says, have I not wept for the one whose life is hard? Was not my soul grieved for the needy? So there's grief is something that takes place in our soul, in that deep part of us, we feel it. And then Matthew 17:23. This is the Lord, again, foretelling his death and explaining it to the disciples, what was coming, and said, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day. And about the disciples, it says, and they were deeply grieved. They were deeply grieved in anticipation of what was coming. And then Matthew 26:38, this is the Lord before going to the cross. He said, my soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me. I mean, again, we're all familiar with these parts of scripture. And two, I say it's kind of unique or interesting that we're talking about grief on the weekend of Easter. And I think of Saturday in particular, the day after the crucifixion, the day before the resurrection. You know, you stop and think about what the disciples must have been going through on this day. We'll get into that. John 21:17 says, Peter, this is when the Lord had resurrected, and Peter was still troubled because of his denial. Okay, even though Jesus has resurrected, he wasn't completely over his grief. Okay, he was grieved and regretful about his denial. So it says Peter was deeply grieved because he said to him a third time, do you love me? If you remember that encounter on the shore that Jesus had with Peter, Jesus knew exactly what Peter needed to be restored. And we'll get into that a little bit later too. And then Ephesians 4:30, it says, do not grieve the Holy Spirit. So the Holy Spirit can be grieved. All right, next slide. Okay, the stages of grief. This goes back to, if you all remember, Kubler-Ross in 1969. She came up, I think she was a nurse. She came up with 5 stages of grief. And at the time, I believe it was thought of as a linear process that people go through. So denial, bargaining, anger, sadness, and then finally to the point of acceptance. And the goal was to get to the point of acceptance. All right. And then it was expanded to 7. So shock or disbelief and, feeling numb, denial of your emotion, saying I'm fine, being angry about what has happened, bargaining, that's often with God. Oh God, if you would just do this. Guilt, you have regrets. There's such a thing is called survivor guilt, people who are left behind, depression, and then acceptance and hope. So this was kind of the real formal beginnings of the research and the understanding of grief and the fact that there's a process that people need to go through. But it's evolved since then to people realize that grief is not a linear process. Grief is a whole series and a whole conglomeration of emotions that people are dealing with. And you don't necessarily go through it in a linear process. All right. So, but I wanted to share that with you because that's really the beginnings of our understanding of grief and helping people through it. One of the main researchers, probably a thanatologist, a psychologist, and one of the main researchers on grief is Robert A. Niemeyer. And I think this is foundational to kind of the approach and the understanding of grief today. He says, a central process in grieving is the attempt to reaffirm or reconstruct a world of meaning that has been challenged by loss. So a lot of the research really circles around that, just that idea. It's an attempt to reaffirm or reconstruct a world of meaning that has been challenged by loss. Okay. And then Bernay Brown, I recently, my wife gave me a book for Christmas called Atlas of the Heart by Bernay Brown, if you've read anything by her. She's an excellent writer, speaker, and researcher. She does research to really empirically try to understand. One of her thesis was on connection in relationship and just the role that grief and loss play in that. And anyway, she's come up what she calls with foundational elements that's based on her research. And so I'm just going to go through these 3 things. The first one is, again, this is from Bernay Brown's research and about loss. She says, while death and separation are tangible losses associated with grief. Some of the participants in her study describe losses that are more difficult to identify or describe. These included the loss of normality, the loss of what could be, and the loss of what we thought we knew or understood about something or someone. So again, if you think of the disciples and what they went through with the Lord's crucifixion and resurrection, and their understanding of and what they thought of him, what they thought his mission was, and what they understood, what they thought they understood, that was completely shattered, blown out of the water. Okay, and so there was huge loss there, and I imagine. I was talking to somebody the other day, and he challenged us to think about Saturday, the day in between. What were the disciples going through? And I had just been recently doing this research, and I thought, man, they're wondering what do we do now? They're just lost. What do we do now? So there was I think they experienced all kinds of grief, the intangible. I mean, they had the tangible loss from his death, but there was all the other intangible losses that they were experiencing. And so the second part aspect of it is longing. It's related to loss. Okay. Longing is not conscious wanting. You're not aware of what it is that you want. It's an involuntary yearning for wholeness, for understanding, for meaning, and for the opportunity to regain or even simply touch what we've lost. Okay. So you think again of the disciples and the longing that they must have been feeling to have Jesus back with them. How much you think of the Emmaus walk, right? And you think of just what it was like for the disciples to be in the presence of Jesus, before the cross, his wisdom, his love, to watch him heal people. I mean, they were on top of the world. And to lose that, there had to been a longing to return to that. Okay. And then third is feeling lost. So grief requires that we reorient every part of our lives, every our physical, emotional, and social worlds, to reorient. Okay. When we imagine the need to do this, most of us picture a painful struggle, to adjust to the tangible change, such, like with someone dying or moving away, a separation. But that's a very limited view of grief. Grief has a very much a broader spectrum for as far as our need to understand it. Because grief reaches into many more experiences besides death, right? And can be challenging for people to articulate, and even more difficult for others to understand what they're going through. And that only adds to the whole idea of feeling lost. Now, think specifically of Peter. Okay, so Peter denies the Lord. Okay, and he feels bad. He regrets doing that. He has shame over doing that. Okay, even after Jesus resurrected and appeared to them, I don't know how many times, Peter was still not through his grief. Peter was still struggling with the fact that he denied the Lord 3 times. He felt he had regret about that, which is, we'll talk about that more a little bit later. And he had shame. And that's one of those, he was feeling lost. Okay. And we'll get into this in a minute here. He had a complicated and what's called a disenfranchised grief, where others may not have been aware of the fact that he was in that deep regret and grief over the fact that he denied the Lord. He says, I'm going to die with you. He was bold in declaring that, but then he shrunk back, right? So he had shame. And but the Lord saw, and the Lord knew exactly what he needed. And when he encountered him on the shore and asked him 3 times, "Do you love me?" He was restoring Peter. He was taking away that shame. And sometimes it's that kind of interaction, encounter we need to have with the Lord to restore us from things that we're going through. And we can feel lost with what's going on internally and the things that we're struggling with. And, we can feel lost with it. We can feel disenfranchised with it. But the encouraging, exciting thing is the Lord sees and the Lord knows. And it's a matter of just knowing how to get to his feet to have him speak personally to us. And I'll get to that in a little bit too, when I talk about transformation prayer. So those 3 elements are all a part of grieving. Now, there's an organization called the Center for Complicated Grief, and they've identified, and I've mentioned a few of them here, 4 types of grief. And the first one is acute, and that occurs right after a death, right after that period of loss. That's where those strong feelings of yearning, longing, and sadness are there, along with anxiety, bitterness, anger, remorse, guilt, and sometimes shame. During that acute phase, the thought, you're thinking mostly about the person who died, and it can be difficult to concentrate on anything else. Acute grief concentrates or dominates a person's life. It's dominating, okay? It's in that initial stage. I was talking to a friend last week. He had just come from a funeral of a coworker whose wife had died. And he said the husband looked like a deer in the headlights at that memorial service. And you can imagine he's in the middle of that acute grief, just wondering, how am I going to cope? What do I do now? I'm alone. I'm without my wife, who I've been with for several years. So it can be very acute. And I mentioned, my father drowning in a boat accident when I was 2. My mom was suddenly left with 6 kids to raise on her own. He was the love of her life. And to suddenly be without him, the grief that she felt and that she went through was extremely acute. It was debilitating. It dominated her. I've heard stories of the days following his drowning. She couldn't get out of bed. My 2 of my aunts were with her at bedside, just trying to help her, trying to get her back on her feet, and they couldn't do it. They couldn't get her. It wasn't until she realized that, well, one of my aunts said something to her that just triggered her. She said, "Boy, I wish you didn't have all these kids to have to deal with now." And my mom, it's like it jolted something loose, and she realized, that's right, these kids, I've got to raise these kids. And that helped her with the integration part of things. Let me just go on from there. Integration is the result of adaptation to the loss. When a person adapts to a loss, grief is not over. Instead, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors related to their loss are integrated in ways that allow them to remember and honor the person who died. Grief finds a place in their life. So that thought that I've got to raise his kids, that was her way of honoring him. That was her way of finding purpose. That's what helped her to get past some of the acute. She still had some acute grief that she never really dealt with and got over, but she adapted and was able to suppress a lot of the other pain, the yearning and the longing and the sadness. She was able to suppress that because she had integrated some of the grief in a way that allowed her to move on and find purpose. Does that make sense? Okay. So then there's complicated grief. That occurs when something interferes with adaptation. When this happens, acute grief can persist for a long period of time. And like I said, for my mom, even though she was able to integrate and adapt in some ways, there were some acute parts of grief that she never got over with. Okay. They can't stop feeling that their loved one might somehow reappear, and they don't see a pathway forward. A future without their loved one seems forever dismal and unappealing. Grief dominates their thoughts and feelings with no respite in sight. Relationships with family and friends can flounder. Life can seem purposeless, as if nothing matters without their loved one. Others begin to feel frustrated, helpless, and discouraged. Even professionals may be uncertain about how to help. People often think this is depression, but complicated grief and depression are not the same thing. Okay. All right. For me personally, being a part of the family where that bomb got dropped, I was only 2 years old. I don't remember a memorial service. I never had a chance to acknowledge him, say goodbye, grieve in any way at all. Nobody was aware of what was going on inside of me. I wasn't aware of what was going on inside of me, but there was definitely a grieving that I was carrying with me, up until I got saved, and even till I was 39. There were things that were just complicated that I wasn't aware of. That once I became aware of, I was able to deal with them, and I'll get to that. Okay, so disenfranchised grief. That's grief that is not openly acknowledged or publicly supported through mourning practices or rituals, because the experience is not valued or counted by others as a loss. For years, I thought my mom and my older siblings were grieving because they had something and they lost it. I learned over time that I was grieving a loss. I was grieving over something that I didn't get to have. Okay, I didn't get to have, and a lot of the details of this came to realization, my awareness, as I learned to do transforming prayer with myself, and it just came to realize different ways that I was grieving, and a lot of it was complicated and disenfranchised type of grief, where it wasn't aware. It was kind of hidden. It was invisible to others and to myself. Things like, the realization that I don't have a father, which means the man who's supposed to show me how to be a man isn't there. I'm not going to know how to be a man. I'm missing something. And again, those type of things were resolved through transforming prayer. But anyway, going on, it says, the grief can also be invisible or hard to see by others. Okay, this is where Peter's grief was disenfranchised. Nobody else saw it but the Lord. Examples of disenfranchised grief include loss of a partner or parent due to divorce, loss of an unborn child and or infertility. Again, loss of something that you're hoping for. The multitude of losses experienced by a survivor of sexual assault, and a loss of a loved one to suicide. Okay, to illustrate the example of disenfranchised grief, we'll take sexual assault survivors. Numerous losses there, many of which are invisible to others. If you've ever done any type of ministry or counseling or TPM with sexual assault survivors, they come out in those sessions, don't they? Some of these losses include loss of one's prior worldview, loss of trust, loss of self-identity and self-esteem, loss of freedom and independence, a loss of sense of safety and security, and a loss of sexual interest. Okay. We in transforming prayer, we talk about a core lie that has to do with your self-identity. And a sexual assault victim, it's an attack on their identity. And it's an attack on, we also talk about a core belief that has to do with your state of being, or what you believe about God. To go through something like that totally attacks, your state of being, how safe you feel in the world. So those are the 4 types of grief that the Center for Complicated Grief have articulated. So, and I'm sure as we're going through this, some of you are thinking of situations and things for yourself, and we'll give you a chance to talk about those in a moment. Let me go on to the next slide. In fact, why don't we do that right now? Why don't we just take some time right now, just to give some of you an opportunity to share with the rest of us some of the thoughts that you're having, things that you're realizing, things that are coming to mind, maybe applications for this. So just when you're ready, unmute yourself and chime in.
One thing you said that was real interesting was that the thing is under the complicated aspect of it, to where you imagine that you'll see your dead one alive again. And that was for months, if not for years, after my dad died, because he was my entire life.
Yeah.
From a spiritual standpoint, I respected him as equivalent to how I see God.
Yep.
And with him being gone, man, that was like, that was what I did. And
Yeah.
and I never was able to process that. And so what's happened now, the rest of my life, whenever I experience any kind of loss, just friendship, whatever, I sit there and I try to imagine that loss being being recovered. In other words, I can once again have another relationship where this is lost, and it's really difficult when I try to process my entire life with that same type of behavior pattern that I learned from my dad's death.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what kind of came to my mind as you were talking about it.
Yeah. And Bruce, I can relate. Before, I processed through my grief up until age 39. There were a couple of times I had dreams where my dad was still alive somewhere. That's that longing, that yearning to have a void filled, right? But since I've processed through it, I haven't had that dream. I haven't had that dream in years. Anybody else have something to share?
Hey, Rick, I was going to, I think falls under the I don't know which one, complicated, maybe disenfranchised. One of the major things that I'm noticing where God these days is giving me room to go ahead and feel grief. I have permission to feel grief, feel the loss. And it goes back to my formative years where my parents were very ill-equipped and immature, to be able to pour into me so that I felt acceptance unconditionally. I felt significant. I felt secure. There was voids in those, and not that there was any evil involved. They were teenage parents with 3 kids before they were 20. Their support system was next to nothing. I mean, they had support. There was physical support for me, and of course some love and so forth. It wasn't void of all that, but just being the person in that environment and not knowing what a reasonable, healthy situation was, you just move through that, and then you go out into the world and you realize how unequipped you are and how scary it is and how much you long for those things. And so to grieve the loss of all that, I'm sure I started as I got saved when I was 25, and at different points in my life. And but as I do, work with Jesus, as he's there to give me unconditional acceptance. He's there to mentor me and to father me and to parent me. Even here I am in my 60s, but that's what he's doing. And you hear that in authors like Eldridge and other, that the Heavenly Father is really going to fill those voids, because he does, and he does it right.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
But it takes a lot to be able to have permission. We tend to want to push those things and keep going in life because life is short, right?
Yep.
But to give yourself a chance to grieve,
Yep.
is I'm still, I still realize it at times and have to slow down and just sit with him and accept all that he gives me around my worth and his mentoring of me and so forth. So.
Yeah. Yeah. You're describing, I think, both a complicated and disenfranchised types of grief. Some people would call it sins of omission, being raised by parents who aren't aware of the need to provide, a safe, secure, nurturing environment for children to grow up in. And as a child growing up in that, you don't have anything else to compare it to. It's disenfranchised because it's invisible. You can't articulate what it is. You feel something, but it just takes time before you become aware of the specifics of it and the need to give it the validation that it needs and to deal with it. And like you said, we're blessed in that. The Lord sees all of it and he wants to minister to us. We can't go back and redo our childhood, but we can experience in him parenting us no matter how old we are.
Yeah.
Which is such a blessing. Yeah. So, okay. Thank you for sharing. Let's go ahead and move on. So moving on to the next slide. All right. So yeah, I wanted to share some relevant and current examples that I think of our complicated and disenfranchised types of grieving. Just the last couple of years have been topsy-turvy for a lot of us for a lot of different reasons. You think of COVID, you think of the political climate, you think of the racial division, what's going on socially and culturally. But anyway, just to kind of go through these, I think of, first thing relevant to grief, COVID deaths, where people weren't able to be with their loved ones in the hospitals to witness their dying, the progression down. And that can complicate the grief process. All of a sudden they get word that their loved one is gone. And then on top of that, during COVID, especially at the beginning, memorial services were canceled or postponed, or if they did have them, they were lightly attended. I had one of my neighbors, he had brain cancer, and he passed the first week in March, the first week after the shutdown. And they asked me to do the memorial service, and I agreed to do it. It wasn't, the typical memorial service where you have, people are together, able to mingle and talk and have a meal afterwards and able to, express their condolences to family members. And, people hear stories of what the lost departed one meant to them. It was outside in a cemetery and people were socially distanced. there were clusters of families here and there, but it was fragmented, and it just wasn't. You just felt like the families were getting shorted on what they needed for them to be able to grieve. I know one of my high school buddies, his parents passed away pretty close to each other. I think it was right after the pandemic, and or before, but their memorial service was scheduled like in June, and it got canceled. I was looking forward to seeing my buddy, and I mean, I knew his parents really, really well, and I wanted to be a part of the celebration of life, and we didn't get to have it. It never got rescheduled. It just got passed over, and to me, that kind of thing complicates the grieving process. It just, because people need those types of ceremonies to be able to process through their grief. Okay, the pandemic, non-death grief and loss that came about as a result of the pandemic. I think of job loss, financial loss, social and familiar interactions that fell off, loss of freedoms, loss of mental health due to anxiety and depression and stress. And I think of the people who already had mental health issues going into the shutdown and the isolation. The Lord, in the beginning, he said, it's not good for man to be alone. It's not good. It's not good. And you think of all the isolation that different groups of people went through. I think of students who all of a sudden went from interacting with their teachers and their classmates, which they need desperately, to having to sit in front of a computer screen and do class online, and just the detriment and just the negative impact of that. I think of the seniors in high school, in their last year of school. You think of all the things that you got to do to celebrate the end of your public schooling, your senior year. Maybe you didn't get to have a prom, you didn't get to do any of that stuff. And so there's grief and loss with that. That can be disenfranchised grief because people don't notice it. I mean, I think we're more aware today culturally, and those things are being addressed, but certainly there's a lot of things that can go under the radar and people are just out there feeling lost. I think of moral and cultural shifts. I think induced by political agendas, the wokeness crowd, transgenderism. I read about, the NCAA swimming, women's swimming, and we're all familiar with that story. These women who have been training their whole lives didn't get to celebrate a victory because of a man who says he's now a woman gets to compete against them and has an extremely huge advantage. I think of the loss that those women are going through. Cancel culture, things like that, things that are going on in our culture and things that are shifting morally. I know for me personally, it grieves me. I mean, I know that the Lord is still sovereign and that he's allowing things to go where they go. Where there's darkness, the light is all that much brighter. I know all that, but it still grieves me to watch the kinds of things that are happening in our culture. It grieves me. And then there's church disunity, because of COVID restrictions and mask policies. There's loss of fellowship. I think of the impact on the church and its unity with the political division and the racial division, et cetera, things like that. All of these things kind of create, and this is backed up by Barna's research, that all of these things create a weariness with people, and a weariness, especially I think with church leaders, to figure out how to deal with some of these things that are happening. it's I think challenging church leadership more than ever to figure out how to hold the unity within our churches and to maintain a certain spirit within their congregations. And then losses of our assumptive world. Okay, and that's a term that goes back to one of the things Bernay Brown said about, losing things that you thought you understood, things that give you a sense of security. So what this means is, it's assumptive world. That means core beliefs that stabilize, ground, or orient people and make them feel secure in their daily lives. It's that's what we assume about our world that makes us feel secure, basically. So you think about what's going on in our world. You think about Ukraine and what Russia is doing to Ukraine. Is the world a safe place and a secure place? For me, I have children and now grandchildren. Is it going to be safe for them? And then specifically, can I trust the schools to have agendas that are consistent with the values that I want for my children? Okay. All the things that are part of my assumptive world that make me feel secure, that make me feel like, okay, it's tough, it's rough, we got the Lord, we're going to be okay. There's things that are kind of tipping it out of balance to just bring those questions up. And, for me personally, I grieve just the direction that things are going in and just how that's going to have an impact on my children and their children. So I'll go ahead and, again, open it back up for anybody who has any other examples or anything that this causes you to think about that's relevant and current for you today.
Rick, this is Greg. So I would think one.
Oh, Greg, you made it. Great. Thank you.
Yes, I did. I don't know what time it is in comparison to Central to Eastern.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
So the current example I would think of is the loss of Great Commission.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure that's particularly for those who have been in a long time, that's a great loss because from the beginning there was thinking this is going to last forever,
right?
Or, for a long time. So that was a pretty big loss. Relevant.
Oh, absolutely. Yep. Yeah. And what I can relate to is when Ridgewood, our church that was part of Great Commission, we dissolved before Great Commission dissolved. That the year that was all happening was a year of grief. And there were things complicating it that made it difficult to progress through. Fortunately, we shifted over to a good church that's become our home. And so we've been able to integrate and there hasn't been any complications with it but there were times where there were some feelings of disenfranchisement where, people just couldn't relate to, there actually were other people who went through similar situations that could, and that was helpful. But so anybody else have anything to add? Brad?
Yeah, I got one. A friend was just messaging me this morning about Matthew 24, and when the love of most will grow cold. That's really been hitting me past several weeks. Honestly, just seeing the absolute carelessness from people inside the church where it should never die, because that's the only place where hope lives is through the church, because the Spirit and the bride both say come. It's not just one or the other. And the church has to be the brightest shining star. And when that hope dwindles because of the bitterness of whatever undealt with issues, just hating the world as it is, all that stuff, I mean, that's all real stuff, and people are doing it in the church and out in the world, and it's very grieving me, and that's kind of what's been aching on me for a couple weeks now.
Yeah, I see. I have to agree with you. I think one of the things that I've realized as a result of the last couple of years is I think of, Ephesians 4:11 talks about, God giving different gifts and leaders in the church for the purpose of equipping the church. And with the things that came out, the disunity that came out, just revealed to me, it exposed just how the leadership has not done an adequate enough job in equipping its people to be able to handle the things that have gone on the past couple of years. And the disunity is fruit of that. I mean, fortunately, I think there have been a number of people in probably every church can say this. There's people that fell away, got angry, but there's people who stuck with it.
Yep.
And maintained the unity and had the level of maturity to look past the circumstances and to stay united. And that's encouraging to think about. And, one of the things that Bernay has said through all this is that, even though, churches have lost people and pastors have resigned, what's remaining is maybe smaller churches, but stronger churches. So there's a stronger foundation to rebuild on, which is good. Okay, I'm going to move on to talk about the transforming prayer perspective when it comes to grief. Transforming prayer mainly deals with lie-based thinking as a root of people's struggles in life with their emotions and their behaviors. It's not a matter of just managing behavior or trying to not feel what you feel, but to focus on what you're feeling, because it's connected and it reveals what you're really believing at a heart level, because that's really where the problem lies. But there's also the aspect of truth-based pain that people feel, grief being one of those. And what I want to do is start by reading Isaiah 53, verse 4. It says, "However, it was our sickness that he himself bore, and our pains that he carried. Yet we ourselves assumed that he had been afflicted, struck down by God, and humiliated. But he was pierced for our offenses. He was crushed for our wrongdoings. The punishment for our well-being was laid upon him, and by his wounds we are healed." So from this verse, we know that the Lord's death accomplished three things. Number one, our sins were removed, forgiven, separated as far as the east is from the west, it says. Number two, our healing is accomplished. And number three, our grief and sorrow are being carried. All right. And this is really a key point for us in knowing how to effectively help people with the grief that they're dealing with. Okay. Now, first point I want to make is the only thing that keeps us in a place where we continue to carry the weight of our grief, the pain of our grief, is our ignorance. We're ignorant of the fact that Jesus is carrying it. Okay. So for example, when our pain of grief is the outcome of a truth that we know, for example, my uncle has died and I no longer have a chance to share the gospel with him. That's the truth. Okay. And I feel pain because of that. I have a longing. I regret, that I didn't get to share with him, or I didn't get to share with him, one more time so that he would finally get it. And now he's gone. That's all true. Okay. God is not going to convince us out of that truth. Okay. Because it's true. He will, however, offer a greater perspective, a greater truth that will allow us to continue to believe that truth without having to feel the pain that truth produces. Now, the best example I can think of is Ed Smith, who's the founder of Transforming Prayer Ministry, he and his wife lost their daughter. Their daughter was about a year old, maybe 18 months, when she was playing on the floor one day, and 3 days later, she had died. She had a brain aneurysm. And the grief that they felt was acute, right? It was hard to integrate that grief and to find purpose and meaning and to be able to go on. It was complicated because of things that they were, his wife in particular, her thoughts were, into her pain was, I'm not going to be able to see her graduate from high school. I'm not going to be there. I'm not going to see her get married and have children. Those are true. Those are true thoughts. And it was, causing her to feel pain. Now, over time, some of their pain persisted, but on anniversaries of her death or her birthday, they felt it all over again until they applied some TPM principles. And this one about the Lord wanting to carry their grief, and the fact that some of our complicated grief can just hold things up. And so in a prayer time with the Lord regarding this loss specifically, dealing with that idea that, the pain coming from this loss and not being able to see her grow up and all those things, the Lord said to them, she lived her full life. This was the purpose and the plan that I had for her. You got to experience everything with her that was intended for you to experience. And that was the greater truth. That was the perspective, the greater perspective that God personally gave them, that helped them to release that pain. And, that's something that you or I could try to point out to them and tell them. But it's not going to have the same impact as when the Lord speaks that truth to them. So, all right. So there are three reasons why we continue to carry the pain of grief. First one there says there's an appropriate time to weep. Ecclesiastes 3 verse 4. There's a time for everything under the sun, it says, and one of them is there's a time to weep. And when somebody's in that acute phase right after the loss, it's time to weep, and it's not time for us to come and try to point out the silver lining to them. It's time to listen. It's time to sit with them, let them tell their story, and we just need to be compassionate, show empathy, and let them feel what they feel. They're not ready to integrate that grief into their lives yet. They need to feel the pain of the loss, because it's true, it's real. Now, what is the appropriate amount of time? It's hard to say. One of the things that I've read about timing and grief and how long, is they said, how long it takes a person to grieve is entirely dependent upon how attached you were to what it was you lost. You could be attached to a person, you could be attached to a dream. I was working with a guy the other day who had been through a divorce, and he was just grieving the loss of the dream of having that special relationship into old age. And it got complicated, things didn't work out, and that's all gone. He's not necessarily grieving, he's grieving the loss of his wife because he's extremely disappointed with the way things went. But he's not grieving, he's grieving intangibles. He's having the secondary grief. Okay. And so typically with a loss of a death of a person, if 18 months has gone by and a person is still in that acute phase, they haven't been able to integrate yet, there's probably some complications or some disenfranchised type of grief that's been invisible, that they haven't been able to identify and work through. And so with this kind of understanding and information and insight, we can come alongside and help somebody process through and get past that stuck phase. All right, second thing, Jesus carries our burdens, the weight of our grief. And sometimes people are ignorant of that. And it's a matter of just explaining to them that Jesus will carry your burden, the weight of your pain. You just have to give it to him. It's that simple. And so a lot of times in TPM, we'll ask people, are you ready to let him carry it? And just in explaining it to them, sometimes they just naturally just give it to them. But we still ask, because maybe there's some things complicating. Maybe there's a reason why they're hanging on to it. And that would be the third thing here. We have a lie-based reason for continuing to carry our burden. For example, I may believe that by continuing to grieve, I prove that I have love for the person that I lost. Okay. Or I may be holding on to some regret for what I did, so that I can use that to remind me to make better decisions in the future. Okay. So there can be a number of things that people are believing that hold up their grieving and being able to integrate it and get to a place of acceptance and peace and hope. Okay, so that's a basic overview of the TPM perspective on grief. Now, I will ask any of my TPM cohorts if you have anything to add to that.
Through my understanding of that, it really came from as a massive relief from people just telling you to get over it.
Yeah.
Rub some dirt on it, distract yourself with something. It's like, I'm not reading the same Bible as you. So it was every single time. You have no idea what the Lord is going to tell you. And
right.
Simply on this screen, like, if this corner down here is the realm of possibilities that I'm expecting him to tell me, every single time it's up here.
Yeah.
And every single time hearing his perspective calms everything.
Yep.
Because that's what it does. Faith comes by hearing through the rhema word of Christ.
Right.
And it's every single time it's fantastic. It's
yeah.
I'm just so blessed by it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I'll address one thing you shared. I think sometimes people are uncomfortable with us continuing to feel the pain, and they need us to feel better so that they won't be uncomfortable. And so a big part of, whether you're a counselor, a pastor, a coach, you need to learn to be okay with people's pain. And because they don't need somebody to come along and share the silver lining with them or tell them to get over it. They need somebody to just sit and listen sometimes. And if you're uncomfortable with people's pain, that's probably because there's something in your own life that you haven't dealt with yet. Okay, moving along here. Okay, so the Barna research. I read 3 articles by Barna that shared some statistics, and I'm not going to bore you with all of them, but there were a few that I picked out that I thought they were relevant. Okay, so first thing, while studying the well-being of pastors, Barna research found that 38% of pastors want to quit. Wait, if I got the whole thing there. Yeah. 38% of the pastors wanted to quit in November of 2021 compared to only 29% in January of 2020. Excuse me, that should be 2020. No, it was 2021. Sorry, I got it right. Yeah, so just in 11 months, it went from 29% to 38%. I think that's a reflection of just the weariness that pastors were feeling in trying to shepherd their people and their churches with all the things that were stirred up and going on in the topsy-turvy world of COVID and so on. 29 to 38%. Next one, more than 4,000 churches closed in America in 2020. Over that same time, over 20,000 pastors left the ministry, and 50% of current pastors say they would leave the ministry if they had another way of making a living. So again, another indication of the fact that they're weary, they're discouraged. Third, the pandemic closed churches, which led to financial constraints for some, and continuing political strife over masks and vaccines are causing fragmentation from many congregations. Okay. Now, this was actually taken from Bernay Brown's book, and she had a chapter, called "When Things Aren't Going or Didn't Go as Desired. What do you do? What do you feel?" So I thought this is a way to bring it home, to make it more personal, especially based on those statistics that I just cited. I think it's important for not just pastors, but for all of us to be able to identify and articulate what we're feeling. Because if we don't, that's going to linger. And if it's going to go unaddressed, it's going to burn us out. Because you can only carry weariness for so long before it has that impact where you just give up. So I wanted to go over these words specifically and what they mean, so that we can have the awareness and be able to identify and deal with these things. Again, I think these are just words that help us to describe the emotions that are part of the experience of disenfranchised and secondary types of grief. They have a wearying effect and can lead to burnout if not identified and addressed. So what that means is it didn't work out how I wanted, and I believe the outcome was outside of my control. Okay. So there's circumstances that are going on that I have no control over. And certainly the last couple of years, that's the case, right? But there can also be regretful feelings. It didn't work out how I wanted, and the outcome was caused by my decisions, my actions, or my failure to act. Okay, so that's where it's more personal. You feel like it's your fault. You feel like you should have either done something or not done something differently. So you have regret over that. And certainly we talked about Peter with his denial. It was regret and shame that he was carrying that the Lord addressed with him and restored him on the shore there. And we know how that empowered Peter. Okay. And then to be discouraged. I'm losing my confidence and enthusiasm about any further effort. I'm losing the motivation and confidence to persist. I haven't lost it yet, but I am losing it. I'm at risk of losing it. I'm discouraged. And then resigned, I've lost it. I've lost my confidence and enthusiasm about any future effort. I've lost the motivation and confidence to persist. And right there, that explains the resignations amongst pastors in those 11 months of 2020, 21. And then frustrated. Something that feels out of my control is preventing me from achieving my desired outcome. So I thought it would be helpful to go through those specific terms, because again, I think it's important because so many of us, we use defense mechanisms, coping skills. In TPM, we call them solutions, where we suppress how we feel or we minimize how we feel. And we don't give ourselves the time to affirm and validate, to identify and then affirm and validate what we're feeling so that we can deal with it in a productive way, constructive way. Because the Lord does not want us. The Lord didn't want Peter to go around feeling regretful and shameful about what he did. He restored him. And so whatever it is for any of us, the Lord does not want us to walk around carrying that. He wants us to restore us. He wants to free us from those things that we're carrying. Okay. And so I think these are, again, back in the beginning, I talked about how grief is not just a linear progressive set of stages that you go through. It's a bunch of emotions that are all over the place. And so I think these are some of the emotions that we can be experiencing when we're actually, the heading is that we're grieving. Okay. And so I think it's important to, because a lot of those, again, I think are examples of what can be what we talked about as complicated or disenfranchised types of grief. You know, the things that are invisible, the things that are hard to articulate. So the more we can identify those, articulate those, the more we're going to be able to deal with those. Okay. Final slide here. Okay. So what is the prescription to be a healthy leader? To be able to help yourself and to help others. Like we said in the very beginning, to have healthy churches, we need healthy leaders. And Bernay, in one of the articles, that's what they said. They addressed that. And I agree wholeheartedly. And C1, that's kind of what we're founded upon, is the idea that for us to have healthy churches, we need healthy leaders. It's got to start there. All right. So here are some things. And you know, my purpose is not to add more burden onto you, but I like the analogy that's given about a fire. You know, I'm not trying to add more logs to your fire that you got to burn. What I'm trying to do, when you think about a fire, for it to be able to burn, you have to have pockets of air. You have to have space in between the things that are burning in order for them to burn. And so I want you to learn how to create that space in your own lives. And so that's what these are about. Because it's in that space it's restorative, it's refreshing, it helps you to regain strength. So first one, return to your first love. More than the purpose that you find in the ministry that you're doing, your main focus has got to be on the Lord and your relationship with him and your love for him. So whatever you do to cultivate that. Secondly, prioritize self-care. In other words, give yourself permission to be on the list of people who need care. And do whatever you need to do to get the care that you need. You know, take time to pray about the things that you're struggling with. Take them to the Lord. Don't just suppress them. And typically with those of us who are in ministry and leadership, we're so focused on helping other people, and that certainly can take up our time and our schedules. And you know, there's a need there for sure, but we burn out because we get so overly focused. We don't set up healthy boundaries, which is one of the points. So you need to prioritize self-care, because if you don't, you'll burn out. Self-awareness, you know, that previous slide where I listed those terms, to be aware of what you're feeling, take inventory, know how to recognize those things and take them to the Lord. You know, your emotions are like the check engine light on your car. Okay. What would happen to your car if you ignored those? Break down. So self-awareness. And that's a skill that can be developed. Then rest and solitude on a regular basis. Pete Scazzero talks a lot about, about doing that, about having a Sabbath, taking the time for solitude and rest. Doing that will they've actually done MRIs of a brain, and when it's in rest and solitude, the parts of the brain that light up have to do with creativity and restoration. Set healthy boundaries with people, because people are going to be needy. They're going to need your time, and you're going to need to set boundaries that allow you to be able to do all the previous things I mentioned already. And then cultivate friendships with peers. One of the Bernay articles talked about is the relationship between leaders and the people that they're ministering to. It tends to be one-sided. They look to you, and you give something to them that they desperately need, and it fulfills a huge void and need in their lives. It doesn't necessarily, I mean, there's, Proverbs said, he who waters will himself be watered. And there's certainly some fulfillment in being a helper. But in terms of what we really need with friendships, it doesn't satisfy it. And so we need to be able to cultivate friendships with peers, people who we feel like we can be vulnerable with, open up to, talk about our struggles with. We can talk about, hey, I'm not resigned yet, but I'm pretty discouraged about how things are going. I'm losing it, but I haven't lost it yet. You need to be able to talk about with somebody who isn't going to tell you to get over it, right? You need somebody who's going to listen and walk with you through it. All right. And then one of the things we have as part of C1 is what we call a dream weekend. And that's, we have about 3 or 4 of these scheduled in the next coming months in different regions of the country. And I went on one in Orlando in January, and it's a time that's designed to cultivate friendships. It's a time for rest and solitude. It's a time for self-awareness. Obviously, it's a time for self-care, reconnecting with the Lord. But basically, we learn some skills that have to do with how to listen with empathy and compassion, and rather than give advice. So we create a healthy space for people to be able to be vulnerable and open up and talk and to be heard. And it's in groups of 3 or 4. And I'm still on a once every couple of weeks Zoom meeting with one of the guys, well, 2 of the guys who were there, and we kind of continue it on. It's all about identifying, what has God done in your life to reveal your gifting, your passion, your ministry, the things that you really want to do for the Lord and accomplish for him, to glorify him. And what are the things that are blocking that? What are the things that are holding you back? And so a dream weekend is a place to begin to talk about those things, unwrap it, talk about it, and gain some self-awareness, and to connect with some others and the Lord in a way that helps you to move forward, helps you to deal with some of the things that you're identifying. So and I would say for those of you who aren't part of C1, those of you who are here as guests from TPN, the dream weekends that we have scheduled are reserved for C1 members first. But there are definitely future dream weekends that if you wanted to come to one of those, you could. But all you'd have to do is go to the C1 website, download the app, and become a member. Doesn't cost a dime. And but as a member, you would be prioritized for a spot in one of those weekends if you wanted to do that. So that's all I have for today. And I just wanted to open it up again just for Q&A and any comments that any of you have to make. And that's how we'll wrap it up. So Q&A is open.
I can't
Rick?
really talk to share, but I want to say, Rick, that's all you have? That's it?
Yeah.
I just want to say quick, grandkids are coming in, but thank you so much. This was great. Thank you.
Great. Glad you liked it. Hey, Dottie.
Hey.
Dottie,
Yeah.
what was the main thing you got?
The way that you have pulled out the different, the complicated, disenfranchised, integrated and acute. those different, I mean, that just spreads it out a little bit more to be able to identify.
It
where
helps
it's
with
at.
understanding, doesn't it?
Yeah, and grieving intangibles. It's like we always knew that,
Yeah,
but it's so good to have the language and the understanding.
yeah,
And it's just sort of spreading everything out, even the language, you know, that's what Bernay's big thing is, give you the language.
right.
Because many of us don't have the language for what we're feeling. So
Yep.
it's, you know, we kind of lump grief all into one, but
Yep.
there's so different, many kinds
Nuances.
and ways to address it. So this has just helped to clarify that. So thank you.
Yep. Have a good time with your grandkids.
Great. Thank you. Happy Easter, everybody.
Oh, you too. Okay, anybody else?
Rick, I was just a couple of things. One, you know, the Ed Smith transformation prayer way of supporting somebody with grief. You know, I've been exposed to that now for a while and learned that, and I think it is so healthy because I don't think I've been in my life. I haven't really been that good at what do you do with someone at the funeral? What do you do with them 6 months later? What do you do with them a year later? And it really gives a really healthy approach to, hey, this is early grief. Just slip into their world and listen and potentially just ask things to get them to talk about it,
Yep.
get it out on the table, and validate what's going on in them.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And what you said, what comes to my mind is, yeah, and then call them in 6 months to check in with them again, see how they're doing.
yeah. Oh, there you go. Yeah. And so that I just it has helped me so much to put things in perspective. The other thing is the stats that you gave on pastors through this COVID period and so many stepping away from their ministries and so forth. I was like, that was new information for me, and gave me a sense of how this has impacted that, you know, so many. I mean, I'm just in my little isolated place here in Michigan, and I see a little, but to have somebody actually do the research and publish that was astounding to me. So,
Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say one statistic I've heard that's pretty well stood the test of time is basically for a course of anyone entering ministry, only 1 in 30 make it to retirement.
1 in 30.
1 in 30. That's
Wow.
And that's held true. That's
Wow.
still pretty true. So we don't see that too often, but overall, that's of course all denominations. That's about what stays. I did want to comment, or just one thing that Rick, if you go a couple slides earlier where you were listing the, just 2 slides earlier, where you were listing between where a pastor feels like, well, it really was out of my control. No, after this one, it's the one, here we go. Disappointed and regretful.
Yeah.
And what I've seen in my own life and others is there's also what I would call remuneration. Something has happened at our church, or multiple things have happened, excuse me, and we get remunerate over between disappointed and regretful. We feel both shame and disappointment, or because of, and grief, because we're not sure if it was our fault, or there was stuff the other group did or the person did, but we go back and forth and we just cycle. We're stuck in this cycle of, yes, it was my fault, no, it wasn't. And I was wondering if you could comment on the connection between shame and grief.
Well, well, look at Peter and his regret for denying the Lord. And I think he did feel shame. You know, guilt is, it means that you did something wrong. You're guilty of it. Shame is more personalized. It means because I did something wrong, I'm bad. Okay. And I think for pastors and what you're describing, it gets into feelings of failure. And I think when pastors get stuck on that, that's when they resign. Because they come to the conclusion that it's their fault. They're bad. They're not good at being a pastor, where that may not be the truth at all. But unfortunately, that's what they're believing is the truth. And that determines how they feel and ultimately what they do. So for any pastor who's kind of stuck in that, I would pray with them and ask them to focus in on the shame that they're feeling and just see where the Lord takes them. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Anything else? Anybody else have any questions or comments that they want to make before we wrap things up?
I say I'm really glad that this is being recorded. At least I heard that initially.
Yeah. Yeah.
Rick, this was excellent, and thank you for your effort in lassoing all this information and putting it together in a way that flowed so well. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome
for this. This was really good.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Again, it goes back to the whole mission of C1, to encourage leaders and to share things with that, put things together and share with that in mind that, yeah, we want the primary thing to be that you take this for your own life, knowing that secondarily, you're going to take it to your church. And that's fine. That's good. That's good. All right.
I was just going to comment that Evelyn has put in the chat a link for the stream weekends, if you want to grab that. And also, you can always, if you want to be able to go to that first, you can always join C1 Network. It is free, and that gets you in with Rick right away. You're first in line when you're with C1 Network. I had to put that plug. Evelyn, was there anything else I missed there?
No, I think that's all right. If an app sounds really overwhelming, if you just go to c1network.org, you can become a member there too. Obviously, the app gives you a lot more resources, but there's basically those two ways to become a member. And if you're still thinking about it, you can fill out the interest form and let us know you're thinking about it. And then if you then decide to become a member, we'll bump you up to priority for those weekends.
Yep. Yeah, and at this point, there's space in the one in June, the weekend of June 17th here in Michigan, where we still haven't. I've got somebody on it. We're looking for a location, and I talked to her yesterday, and she's put some things together. So, but I think there's still space. So, all right, Evelyn, thank you, and. Let's see, Greg Stanager. Hey, Dan, welcome. Coming in. Did you just get here?
No, I've been here, I don't know, half hour or a little more. Yep.
Okay, good. Yeah, I just noticed that you were there like a minute ago. So glad you could catch the tail end of things. Any thoughts or anything that you want to chime in with?
No, I'll be watching the recording later.
Okay.
Had some other people interested in this meeting too, so then they'll probably watch the recording as well.
Great. And special thanks to my TPM peeps for showing up, because that really allowed us to do this and get the recording done. So thank you so much. And Greg Stanager, will you pray to end our time?
Certainly. Well, Lord, just thanks for Rick and his work, and thanks for everybody that could come. Ask it, Lord, too, for the recording, that if for those that hear this later, they would use this in their lives, and you would be you would be stepping into our lives even as we process grief and shame and all the other areas you need to clean up. And thank you again for your work through Rick, and for these pastors here and leaders that are leading out, helping people every day. I just ask you to give them strength and show them how you can do even more in their hearts. We do pray this in your name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Craig. Hey, happy Easter, everybody.